Hello everyone, welcome to Macroeconomic Theory. I'm the module leader Peng Zhou, or you can simply call me Joe. This module aims to give you a thorough understanding of the questions, methods, and techniques of macroeconomics. In fact, the macroeconomic questions are exactly the same as those you studied in your A-level and first-year macroeconomics. That is, the long-run economic growth and the short-run business cycle. The difference of this module is that we are going to adopt the most frontier macroeconomic methodology to deal with the same questions. That is, macroeconomic models with the so-called micro foundation. What you have been learning in A-level and first year is in the old-fashioned macroeconomic modeling tradition, basically studying aggregate macro behavior with aggregate macro variables. However, since 1980s, this methodology was largely discarded because some smart macroeconomists found that these macro relationships based on macro variables are very shaky. A fundamental methodological revolution in 1980s is to rebuild macroeconomic models from microeconomic principles, which is also called micro foundation. This is the mainstream methodology adopted by most central banks and policymakers in the world. Therefore, after this module, you will not only understand macroeconomic phenomena better, but also get ready to work for the government. Now, let's start the journey. First, some administrative information of the module. For your convenience, I compile all information of this module on this website, so that you don't have to click countless buttons to find what you need and miss important information from time to time. This one-stop information hub received good feedback from previous students, especially during the pandemic, so I hope you can like it as well. The textbook for this module is Macroeconomics, written by Williamson. If you want more technical details, you can also take a look at the reference book published by Gilman. I believe you can find these books in the library, but if you want to buy your own books, I also provided Amazon links on the module webpage too. You can buy the books as you like. Communication is extremely important for learning and teaching. If you have any questions, I provide you various ways to contact me. The preferred way of asking questions is via Dropbox commenting tools. If you do not know what Dropbox is, it is a leading cloud technology for file sharing and communication. There are 3 advantages of using something like Dropbox. First, you can ask specific questions by quoting where your question locates in slides and documents. Otherwise, you have to repeat the context in your emails, which is quite troublesome. Second, what you want to ask may already been asked by previous students. I have accumulated many such knowledge capital, as you can see if you click on the slides and tutorials on the website. It is very likely to find the answers to your questions without even have to ask me over again. Third, students can communicate with each other using the commenting tool. You may get your answers even faster from your peers than from me, especially during the exam period. Cloud technology is essential office skills you will have to learn in your future career. So why not having a head start now and improve your employability? It would be a shining point on your CV if you write you are familiar with the cloud technology. Well, if you have some general questions unrelated to a specific lecture or tutorial, then you are welcome to ask me using emails and visit me during the office hour when the pandemic is over. Please do not leave all questions until the last several days before the exam. I usually receive 20 emails throughout the entire term, but over 200 emails on the last day before the exam. So if you want more detailed and timely response, please ask them during the term. The formal assessments are 2 closed exams, a 1-hour exam in autumn semester accounting for 30% of the module mark, and a 2-hour exam accounting for 70%. Note that I will organize a trading game in the spring semester to apply your macroeconomic theory to investment practice, so that you can experience what an investment banker's life feels like. As long as you participate, you will get 4 marks, regardless of your performance. Please do attend in the due course. To suit different needs and levels of learning, apart from these formal assessments, I also give you 2 voluntary assessments to help you apply theory into practice of fiscal policy making and monetary policy making. They are not included in your final module mark, but feedbacks will be given to you if you choose to challenge yourself. It is a good learning by doing opportunity for you to prepare for future career as an economist. Okay, now let's begin with the substance of the module. As mentioned earlier, this module focuses on the mainstream macroeconomic theories, which are developed and adopted by the most influential economists and policymakers. However, it doesn't mean that these mainstream economists are always right. In fact, as you will see later when we introduce the history of macroeconomic theory, the mainstream keeps making mistakes. And the mainstream has changed from one school of thought to another throughout the economic history. Nevertheless, what we are going to do is to understand the state of art before we criticize it. The purpose of this module, therefore, is to show you how to use the mainstream theory to understand what the economy is, which is a descriptive job, and what the economy should be, which is a prescriptive job. Of course, apart from those, you also want to get a good mark and a decent job after graduation, and if possible, you want to impress your friends and parents with what you have learned from this module. Most importantly, you will finally understand what the hell those economists are talking about in TV and not be fooled around by them. And probably that is the most important purpose of learning this module. Macroeconomics is very sophisticated because it discusses the sophisticated economic system. My suggestion is always bear the big picture in your mind before jumping into the technical details when you learn macroeconomics. This module, in fact any scientific knowledge, follows a general logic that the question determines the method and the method determines the technique, rather than the other way around. Always ask yourself, what is the question you want to answer, and then ask what the most appropriate method to deal with this question, and then the last thing to worry about is the technique. Many students get stuck in learning because they forget where they are in the big picture. Not only students, actually many economists make the same mistakes too. I know a lot of smart economists doing fancy skills and techniques in their modeling without knowing why they are doing this. Please follow the link here and read the essay written by Nobel Prize laureate Paul Krugman to criticize this phenomena in economics. With the big picture in your mind, the learning objectives of this lecture is to know the questions first, the methods, and the techniques of modern macroeconomic theory. We will also give a brief introduction of the history of macroeconomic theory. So first thing first, the questions of macroeconomic theory. We all know that there are 2 branches of economics, microeconomics and macroeconomics. The fundamental difference between the two is that microeconomics focuses on the individual behavior, including consumers and firms in specific markets, while macroeconomics focuses on the aggregate behavior of the entire economy. It usually does not pay special attention to a particular consumer or a particular firm, but the aggregate consumption and production. Within macroeconomics, there are again two fundamental issues. The first one is economic growth, which discusses changes of the long-run trend of the macroeconomy. The second one is business cycle, which discusses deviations from the trend. Another way of looking at the two fundamental issues of macroeconomics is the frequency of changes. The trend only changes very slowly, so economic growth is driven by low-frequency factors like technology and institutions. Deviations from the trend changes much faster, so business cycle is driven by high-frequency factors like energy prices and financial crisis. Therefore, economic growth is more a first-order issue, while business cycle is a second-order issue, because if an economy can grow fast, fluctuations seem less important. In fact, economic growth is the most important policy goal of developing economies like China and India, because they have to catch up as fast as they can. However, in developed economies like the US and the UK, growth is very slow anyway. The policy effort is therefore devoted to minimize the business cycles. In this module, we will only focus on business cycle theories, while leaving economic growth theories for another module. To give you a bit more intuition of what we are talking about, let's look at the data. Long-run economic growth studies why the blue trend of aggregate variables like GDP changes over time and across countries, while short-run business cycle studies why deviations from the trend are sometimes positive and sometimes negative, or booms and recessions. An obvious challenge of the two macroeconomic issues is how can we separate the trend from deviations in the first place? There are several popular ways to filter out the cycles from the trend, or indeed filter out the high-frequency changes from the low-frequency changes. These include log linear filter, HP filter, CLM filter, etc. I myself published a paper on this topic comparing the job of separating trend from cycles to the job of separating yolk from white of an egg. If you're interested, you can download the paper following the link here, but it is not required for the exam. As mentioned earlier, this module is going to focus on short-run business cycles. I've extracted the cycle component from the trend already and plotted in the graph on the left. There are three types of questions of business cycles, which are consistently observed in the macroeconomy. The first type is volatilities of macroeconomic variables. Different markets tend to have different volatilities. We need the baseline as a comparison basis because there are so many macroeconomic variables. An obvious choice is GDP, which is denoted by Y here. Compared to GDP, consumption always has a lower volatility, while investment always has a higher volatility during the business cycle. It is more complicated in labor market, however, where there are two economic decisions. One is to determine whether or not to work, or unemployment rate. It is also called the extensive margin because it measures how extensively people work. The other decision is to determine how much to work if employed. It is also called intensive margin because it measures how intensively people work. The volatility of unemployment rate or extensive margin is always greater than that of working hours or intensive margin. These stylized facts on volatilities are all about a single variable, while the second type of stylized facts on business cycles are the relationships between variables. They are about the co-movements of a pair of variables. As you can see in the data, consumption C, investment I, employment N, and wage W are all positively correlated with GDP Y. Again, here we use GDP or output as the basis to define cyclicality. The third type of stylized facts on business cycles are about the persistence of these variables after disturbing shock. If, say, there is a negative shock dragging the economy to recession, such as the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, then the maximum effect takes place not right away, but after several quarters, and then diminishes gradually after at least 20 quarters. It is a very sluggish adjustment. The job of macroeconomic theory is to develop models to explain all three sets of stylized facts, which are the research questions of business cycles. The question determines the method. Now let's move on to the methods of answering the two fundamental macroeconomic questions. Let's begin with a small quiz. I show you 4 graphs here. Can you find anything in common among these 4 graphs? Figure A is some toy aeroplanes or model planes. Figure B is some fashion models. Figure C is the map of London Underground. And figure D, as you can tell, is economic models. Yes, you may already see that the common thing of the 4 figures is that they are all models in some sense. But they are so different, why do we call them models? What is a model anyway? The first feature of models is that they must be simplified. Take figure A, for example. You need to ignore many details of a real plane to make a model plane for kids, just like economic models, which ignore many details like individual level factors, because you cannot address everything in a model. You can only focus on factors of the same importance and forget about other relatively trivial factors. The second feature of models is that they are more or less idealized. Take figure B, for example. You would never expect you to look the same as the models in those fashion products, don't you? Just like in economic models, we may assume people are rational, but in reality people are not. In fact, people are stupid sometimes, just like the petrol maniac lately. However, you cannot model stupidity because that is too random to describe. You can only model rationality and leave those unpredictability into the random error term of the model. You may ask, well, if models are not realistic, what is the point then? This leads to the third feature of models. They must be informative. Quoting a famous statistician, George Box, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Take figure C as example. The map of London Underground. It is a bit distorted, to be honest, in proportion and distance. But that doesn't really matter, because what you want to know from the map is the relative location of stations, rather than showing how London looks like. It is awfully wrong, but extremely useful. Just like economic models, there might be prediction errors from time to time, but households, firms, and governments can use the predictions to inform their decisions. That is the ultimate purpose of modeling, to provide information for action. Models are also an advantage for economic graduates compared to business management students, That is why in business schools there are only two types of programs: economic programs and non-economic programs. So you are very unique sitting here. According to the ONS data, economic graduates earn 11% higher wages than average. That is to reward you for your effort in learning quantitative modeling skills. Because everyone knows that the central banks should lower the interest rate in recessions, but only economists know how much percent lower. You can only do that with quantitative models. Turning to macroeconomic models, only most important macroeconomic variables are considered, like output or GDP, labor input or employment, and capital input or investment. Other individual level details are basically ignored to be simplified. It is like drawing maps where you usually focus on the streets while ignoring the trees or stones on the street. If you include more details, then the model should explain more stylized facts of business cycles. However, we never try to explain everything in one model because a one-to-one map is useless. Remember, we are modelers, not painters. The purpose of modeling is to be informative, not resembling. Now that we know what models are and what models are for, we move on to how to build models. There are 3 steps. Like cooking a meal, you first need to decide ingredients for your models. Do you focus on GDP or employment or investment? It is like you decide to cook potato, then get some potatoes. The second step is to decide the model features. Are they static or dynamic? Are they deterministic or stochastic? Using the cooking metaphor again, it is like choosing between the British way of cooking potatoes, that is chips, and the Chinese way of cooking potatoes, that is stir-frying potato strips. Okay, the third step of modeling is to link the ingredients. Are they ad hoc or microfounded? I will explain what is ad hoc and microfounded soon. But this step is just like you're going to combine potatoes with other ingredients like salt, pepper, and ketchup. So now let's look at the ingredients of a model first. In macroeconomic models, the ingredients are simply the macroeconomic variables like GDP, employment, and investment. Note that depending on the research question at hand, you may not have employment or you may not have investment. But a macroeconomic model always has GDP, okay, because GDP is the central piece of measuring the macroeconomy. GDP is also called output. Sometimes I'll use it interchangeably because it is the baseline to define growth of the economy or business cycles of the economy. There are different ways of categorizing ingredients of a model. The most popular one is economic logic, which distinguishes quantities from prices. GDP is the quantity of output market, while inflation is the price of output market. Employment is the quantity of one of the input markets, labor market, while wage is the price of labor market. Investment is the quantity of another input market, capital market, and interest rate is the price of capital market. So you either have price or quantity in economic models, and these are the logic of economics. The second logic of categorizing the ingredients is mathematical. A model always has some endogenous variables which are to be explained by the model. They are determined within the model, usually including GDP and inflation, because output market is the baseline. Depending on the research questions, the model can also include employment and capital. On the other hand, a model also has some exogenous variables, which are used to explain the endogenous variables. The exogenous variables are determined outside the model, including various shocks like productivity shock and monetary policy shock. Apart from these variables, endogenous variables and exogenous variables, a model also needs some constant or time-varying parameters to connect endogenous and exogenous variables to form the model equations. Another logic of classifying variables in a model is by measurement. If the variable is measured during a period of time, then it is a flow variable, such as births and investment. If the variable is measured at a point in time, then it is a stock variable, such as population and capital. You can imagine a bathtub to distinguish these two types of variables. The flow is the water getting into the tub over a given period of time, while the stock is the height of the water at a particular point in time. They are measured differently, but they are actually the same thing. The second step of building a model is to decide the features of the model. After determining which variables to include, you must determine if the model is a static one or a dynamic one. Well, again, let's go back to our big picture. The question determines the method. If you only want to explain a market without intertemporal interdependence, that is, what you do today is only relevant in the current period and it does not carry over to the next period, like the employment decisions, then you should choose a static model. We will discuss this type of models in topic 1, the business cycles in the labor market. In contrast, if the question does include intertemporal interdependence, that is, what you do today affects both today and tomorrow, like investment decisions, then we should choose a dynamic model, of course. We will discuss this type of models in topic 2, business cycles in the capital market. Furthermore, if the model is dynamic, then you will need to consider an additional feature. Is the model deterministic or stochastic? Again, we need to resort to the question at hand to determine the method. If uncertainty does not matter, such as when we are discussing long-run economic growth, then we can safely ignore uncertainties as a whole and choose a deterministic model. However, if we are discussing short-run business cycles, then uncertainties do matter for people's decision-making. In this case, we usually choose stochastic models to take into account of the role of people's expectations under uncertainties. To recap, recall that the question determines the method, so don't forget why we are setting up models, because we are trying to solve a specific question. The final step of modeling is to link all model ingredients with the chosen model features. In the history of macroeconomic theory, there are two ways of building such links. The first approach is called Adhoc Modeling, which were the mainstream from 1930s to 1970s. Adhoc is a Latin phrase meaning for a particular purpose. These models are built piece by piece, and each piece is for a particular purpose. But different pieces of a model do not necessarily come from the same logic. For example, the IS-LM model you have learned in your first year is an ad hoc model, because the IS model describes how goods market achieves equilibrium, while the LM model describes how money market obtains equilibrium, and they are set up separately without the same logic underlying the two curves. And later on in the 1950s, more and more pieces are separately and independently developed and added onto the IS-LM model, such as the Phillips curve, arriving at the AS-AD model. All these pieces are not consistently derived, but separately assumed. The alternative approach is Microfounded Modeling, which is the mainstream from 1980s onwards to the present day. It started with the new classical RBC models in the 1980s and popularized by the new Keynesian models or the DSGE models since 1990s. The two prevailing schools are both called new because they are microfounded in the sense that all macroeconomic relationships are consistently derived from two micro foundations. The first one is optimization and the second one is equilibrium. The first principle, optimization, is about how individuals make decisions, and the second principle, equilibrium, is about how individuals interact. In a typical microfounded model, individuals always optimize. For example, consumers or households maximize utility subject to budget constraints. Producers or firms maximize profit subject to technological constraints. Banks maximize risk-adjusted profit, and governments minimize social welfare loss or maximize their votes. These are exactly the same as what you have learned from Macroeconomic Theory. Essentially, optimization behavior of individuals is to efficiently allocate two economic resources. The first one is goods. Goods are to be spent smartly to balance today's consumption and tomorrow's investment. And the second is time. Time is to be spent also smartly to balance leisure and labor. In fact, time is more important resources than goods because if you consume goods, you spend money, and money can be re-earned, right? You can earn your money back. But if you spend time, it will be gone forever. You can never earn time back. It is non-reproducible, so make sure you use your time economically. Optimization is to make sure each individual is happy, while equilibrium is to make sure all individuals can be happy at the same time. All markets must clear to have an equilibrium. In an equilibrium, there is no excess supply or excess demand. There is no one left unsatisfied. For those graphical learners, economic models can sometimes be visualized in a flowchart like this. There are usually three economic agents: consumers, firms, and the government. Consumers are the demand side of output market, paying money to firms, which are the supply side. The role is reversed in input markets. Consumers are the supply side of the labor market, providing labor input to firms, which are now the demand side of the labor market. At the same time, rich consumers provide credit to poor consumers in the credit market, and capital-abundant firms invest for the future production in the capital market. To stabilize business cycles, the government uses its fiscal policy and monetary policy to intervene the quantities and prices of the output and input markets. The question determines the method, and the method determines the technique. Now let's briefly talk about what economic techniques we're going to use in this module to operationalize our method. To analyze the model, you essentially need two types of techniques. The first set of techniques is equation solving technique. When we set up the model following the three-step approach, the assumptions are basically the starting point of our analysis. To arrive at the finishing line, you need to deduce or derive the solutions of the model. It is to transform a model from its structural form to its reduced form. The structural form represents mutual causalities among endogenous variables, so it is difficult to see the pure causality. In contrast, the reduced form, or the solution of the model, is to express each endogenous variable by only exogenous variables and parameters. In this way, you can see how endogenous variables are actually determined by exogenous variables and parameters. The second set of techniques is empirical techniques, which is about estimating and testing the model against the data. You will learn how to do this in another module, econometrics. And this module here only focuses on the theory part. That is why I make it in gray font. In fact, the two sets of techniques of economics correspond to two types of logics. Solution techniques are deductive by nature because it is purely about mathematical operations. It is nothing to do with data. In contrast, empirical techniques are inductive in nature because it involves data. As we said, the method determines the technique. Different types of models should be solved by different solution techniques. In our module, we will only discuss deterministic models. So solving a model like this is essentially solving a simultaneous equation system. If you have ever done GCSE maths, then you should be able to do all the jobs in this module. For simple models like ours, you basically apply the substitution method to solve a simultaneous equation system. For example, in the two unknown equation system, x plus y equals to 1 and x minus y equals to 2, we basically express one of the unknown, say y, by x in the first equation. That is, y equals to 1 minus x. And then substitute y in this equation into the second equation so that we end up with only one unknown, that is x. Then you can solve it for both. For more than two unknowns, you do the same. Just iterate until there is only one unknown left in the equation system. The substitution method can be used to solve all models in this module and in your third year modules as well. One important thing I would like to emphasize is that you can always find a graphical way to show the equation solving process. Note that these are not two different processes. They are alternative but equivalent ways of looking at the same thing, that is, solving the model. Graphs are not different from equations. There is always an equation behind each curve in the graph. So don't use your imaginations to derive graphical models. Use maths to derive the graphs. If you ever plan to do a PhD in your future, then you may face a very complicated equation system, which can no longer be solved by hand or by substitution method. In this case, you will have to learn the Newton method, which is a very smart numerical algorithm. I used to teach this module, and you can still find the course on my website if you're interested. It is one of the most challenging but fun modules I ever taught. But this is not required for this module. It's not for the exam of this module. For stochastic models, which we are not going to cover in this module, we use perturbation method and projection method to solve them. But again, they are PhD level techniques, so you don't have to worry about it for now. And I told you this just to show off my knowledge. Haha. Now let's briefly walk through the history of macroeconomics to know where we are standing in the present day. It is a very brief introduction, and it is not part of the exam, but it is very useful to understand why macroeconomics look like what we are studying nowadays. There are hundreds of schools of thought in the history of macroeconomics. A useful logic to understand the evolution of economic thoughts is the relationship between market and government. Before modern economics was even born, there were two contradictory viewpoints on whether markets or government should take the lead in managing the economy. The physiocracy argues for market allocation, while the mercantilism argues for government intervention. In 1776, Adam Smith published his famous book, Wealth of Nations, marked the birth of modern economics. Adam Smith is also called the father of economics. In fact, I feel a little bit ironic about this title of father of economics because obviously you cannot give birth to anything without the mother of economics. Anyway, Adam Smith established the fundamental principle of classical economics, that market is the invisible hand to allocate resources efficiently, and government should not intervene. Capitalism started to surge since then, and industrial revolution made the human society to prosper. In the late 19th century, some very smart economists mathematicalized economics into quantitative models, which was called the marginal revolution. It gives birth to the so-called new classical economics. The difference from the old classical is the use of mathematical models, which became the dominant mainstream school of thought in the beginning of the 20th century. Everything was smooth and great until the Great Depression in 1929 to 1933. The unprecedented crisis trashed the classical and new classical theory, which argued that free market is enough, government doesn't have to intervene. On reflection of the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes published his revolutionary work, The General Theory, which marked the birth of the Keynesian school. Different from the classicals, the Keynesian school argues for the importance of government in managing the economy. He thinks that the classical and the new classical schools are only correct in the very, very long run, but useless in practice. You may all heard about this famous quote, "In the long run, we are all dead." Keynes's followers, like Higgs, combined the new classical mathematical models with Keynesian's idea and developed the IS-LM model. The PP here stands for the Phillips curve, developed by Phillips in 1950s. This is also called the new classical synthesis because it combines the new classical and the Keynesian's ideas. This synthesis leads to the mainstream economic models since the 1950s. Counter-cyclical government interventions become an important policy aim. It means when there is a recession, the government just implement expansionary fiscal policies and monetary policies so that they can drag the economy out of the recession. Everything worked just fine until the oil crisis in the 1970s. The Keynesian model stopped working again. During the oil crisis, the government used expansionary policies to stimulate the economy, with the hope that the economy will be kicked out of the trap. However, output no longer grew after this expansionary policy. Instead, the inflation was very, very high. It is called stagflation, which means stagnant in output and high inflation. The Nobel Prize laureate Lucas criticized the Keynesian models as treating people like stones. If you kick the same stone 10 times, the stone will roll the same distance 10 times. But if you kick the same person 10 times, unless he is stupid, he will kick back the second time if you kick him, because people have rational expectations and they can learn. In the 1980s, Prescott, following Lucas's idea, developed the Microfounded Models. so that all the models are based on the microeconomic principles. People have rational expectations. The microfounded models with rational expectations is called the new classical. Note that this new here is NEW, not to be confused with NEO, the new classical. The new classical school are classical because they share the same policy implication, that is, government interventions should be minimized. As a response, the Keynesians introduced microfoundation and rational expectation as well into their models, and they further assume price rigidity and the Taylor rule of monetary policy. We will discuss all these things in the future lectures, so don't worry if you don't understand what these phrases mean. They call themselves New Keynesian because they are new and Keynesian. It is the second time the Keynesian and classical school of thought converge in history. So it is also called the new classical synthesis. These complicated models are called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium or DSGE models, adopted by most governments in policy making nowadays. Apart from these mainstream schools, there are some heterodox schools of thought challenging the mainstream throughout the history. For example, the Marxian school was developed against the classical in the mid-19th century. The classical school only discusses how output is produced, but not how it is distributed. Karl Marx published a famous book called Capital to criticize the capitalism. In the 20th century, institutionalism and new institutionalism criticized the omission of institutions in the new classical school. The Austrian school is even more radical. It criticizes both classical and Keynesian schools. It pushes the liberalism to the extreme. The best thing a government can do is to do nothing. They are extremely pessimistic about governments. So that's why they are not mainstream, because the government would never buy this idea of being useless, right? The monetarist, mainly Friedman, took an eclectic stance between New Classical and Keynesian, closer to New Classical. We will learn the model Friedman developed in our module later on. To summarize, the primary logic underlying the entire economic history is the role of market and government in managing the economy. The mainstream school shifts between the classical tradition and the Keynesian tradition with evolving modeling methods. This part is not in your exam, but extremely useful for you to understand macroeconomics, not only for this module, but also for your modules in the year 3. If you are interested, you are welcome to read the rest of the slides for more detailed explanations of what we have mentioned on this slide. It's just for fun and for knowledge, not for exam. If you have anything you don't understand, you're welcome to ask questions using the Dropbox tool. Have fun!